RC has been around for a very long time now, and during that time it has become something very different compared to what we used to have. To put it simply, things have changed, and in this video we'll be looking at some of the pros and cons of old and new RC racing. Before we begin, let me tell you something. As of the time of this recording and the video being uploaded, I am 24 years old. I wasn't around before the new millennium, and as such, some finer details about old RC racing may not be included, so please forgive me in that respect if I happen to leave something more common back in the day out. Also, like the title suggests, I'll only be covering the pros and cons of RC racing in 10 scale specifically. I'll be making an 8 scale video soon after this one. Before I begin, I'd like to thank this video's sponsors RC Trophy Chasers, Cow RC, and A-Main Hobbies, links in the description below. Now, when I talk about old RC, I'm mainly going to be talking about off-road RC racing from the early 80s to the mid-2000s, as that was generally the era where lots of the tech used was pretty much the same regarding motor, battery technology, and general design. However, that doesn't mean things outside of that didn't change, so let's start with the absolute beginning of early RC racing for 10th scale. During the early 80s, many of the cars that we would see on the track would be from Tamiya, as those were the most popular off-road 10th scale vehicles on the market. To put it bluntly, they weren't race-built vehicles. They were meant to look scale while driving on scale-style surfaces. Of course though, with anything that has wheels, people will want to race and modify them. This led to a lot of weird mods like brass wheels, lead weights, and other things that made sense with the bro science, but not much else. There was also the electronic part of things. Back then you had the standards of brushed motors, mechanical speed controllers, and NiCad batteries. Now what this basically meant was not that pretty much all cars at the time lasted a solid 7 minutes on a charge at most. Not only that, but you usually had to solder your own batteries together in order to make them work. Even though all those problems and antiquated technologies, 10 scale RC racing began to grow more and more to the point where 10 scale off-road racing kits, specifically designed for the purpose of getting around the track quickly as possible, became more mainstream, like the RC10, Kyosho Scorpion, and a few others later down the line like the Schumacher Cat. This is when RC 10 scale racing began to get a little bit more popular and a little bit more accessible. In the late 80s and early 90s, things like electronic speed controllers began to get a lot more popular as they were more efficient than mechanical ones. Another thing that started to change during this time were the tracks being raced. During the 80s, most tracks that were being built at the time were loose farm dirt tracks with smaller jumps. They were loamy, soft, and the amount of grip you had entirely depended on how well your tire was able to bite into the soft dirt. Taking a look at old tire designs, you'll see that they were more like motocross style than anything else. The very good thing about this is the fact that since tires were more motocross in design and construction, and because they weren't being run on abrasive surfaces for the most part, tires tended to last a lot longer than the tires we use today in 10th scale. It's also important to note that pretty much all the cars at the time were made for these types of traffic surfaces in the first place. Rear motor cars were the standard and they needed to be in order to be the traction needed. Over time though, tracks began to change a bit. More and more places were trying new track building technique as they usually ended up with much harder and abrasive surfaces. As the grip began to rise, the tire choice and car design as a whole began to change with it. They were still rear motor, but now they had graphite or composite chassis, wider wheels, and other design things I'll get to later. I made a whole video talking about the RC tracks and how they've changed over time, so if you'd like to see that, I'll link it in the description below. Long story short, RC drivers wanted a more consistent track to race on, and track owners were willing to try different things to make it happen. Even still, the general design of buggies remained the same for the most part. Rear motor, channel style chassis, battery solder down the middle, you saw it everywhere. That's when in the mid-2000s, two things would change RC to bring it into a newer, faster, and arguably more dangerous age. Even though brushless technology and LiPo battery technology had been around for a little bit before the mid-2000s, RC racers hadn't really begun to make them mainstream until about this time period. There were a few upsides to brushless motors and LiPo batteries, so let's talk about that for a moment. Starting with the motor side. Even though it's given the same voltage, a brushed motor will technically hit a higher RPM than a brushless motor if unladen. The brushless motor will have a lot more torque and be able to give a higher RPM if put in a practical application. Not only that, but brushless motors are generally maintenance free for the most part. The only parts on the brushless motor that will wear will be the bearings, and those can be changed relatively easy on most motors. Moving on to LiPo batteries, to put it in layman's terms, lithium polymer batteries, or LiPos, are much more energy dense than nickel metal hydride or especially NiCad batteries, and they tend to last a lot longer when under load due to the voltage not dropping as much. There are some downsides which we'll get to later, but for the most part both brushless motors and LiPo batteries really brought 10 scale RC racers up a level in terms of power and speed. However, we have seen tech evolve forward before in the electronic speed controller back in the 80s and 90s. So what makes the LiPo battery and brushless motor different? Well, on top of that new technology, there's also a new design being pushed in RC 10 scale racing as a whole, specifically in two-wheel drive buggies. Enter the TLR22 two-wheel drive buggy. Even though this buggy didn't win any Worlds races at the time, it was still a huge step up in terms of pure track performance compared to anything else that was out on the market at the time. What made this car different was two things: the machined aluminum chassis and the fact that it was among the first mainstream out-of-the-box cars you could run as a mid-motor configuration. The 22 would go on to inspire other brands to follow suit in terms of their designs, particularly the B5 and B5M from Associated, the Kyosho RB6 later down the line, and 10 scale was entering a new age of highly specialized cars that were made pretty much exclusively for racing. Along with this, tracks were getting higher and higher in terms of traction, and to a certain point, you'd be hard pressed to find an outdoor track that catered to 10 scale cars. Most tracks had moved indoors and were using many different methods to keep the traction up at all times. So high in fact that slick tires began to be the primary design of tire for these indoor tracks. Even though many track owners would try and ban them to a certain extent, eventually many capitulated and allowed them later on. There's also the rise of 10 scale carpet tracks, but like I said before, I've made a video talking about them before, so be sure to check that out in the description below. Over time, due to the rise of traction in different tracks and due to the idea of wanting more corner speed, the mid-motor configuration became the main design for pretty much all 10 scale two-wheel drive buggies. On top of that, there was also changes in designs and battery shapes, with the long 2S stick pack being phased out in favor of 2S shorty packs, and other things like wheel hexes becoming the norm somewhere down the line as well. Now, I'm skimming over a lot right now in terms of the history of how RC cars have evolved in 10 scale, and I could go on and on about it. But for now, let's get into the pros and cons on old and new RC racing. The battery situation of modern day RC racing is both a blessing and a curse, something you'll see as a running theme, so allow me to explain. Back in the olden days of RC, batteries had to be soldered together manually cell by cell, and usually there were 6, 7, or even 8 cells. And even then, they didn't last long at all. Some things that we take for granted like warm-up laps were simply not a thing back then because the car simply wouldn't last long enough to do a warm-up lap, and the rest of the race. These days, it's not uncommon for batteries to last well above 15 minutes on a charge. It's not advised, which we'll get to in a moment, but it can be done. The thing that holds batteries back these days is twofold. For one, LiPos don't last as long as NIM or NiCad batteries in terms of lifespan. If you have an old nickel metal hydride battery in storage right now, you could probably recharge it and run it just fine. If you tried this with a LiPo of the same age, bad things would happen. LiPo batteries require a lot more care and attention compared to older batteries, like having to be storage charged after usage and storage to make sure they don't blow up, not be over discharged to make sure they don't blow up, and not damaged too badly to ensure they don't blow up. All in all, even though LiPo batteries are a lot more convenient and powerful than older NIM and NiCad batteries, they are a lot more dangerous and, like I said before, expensive. Next up we have the tire situation. Once again, a blessing and a curse. Like I said before in my Evolution of Tracks video, the usage of slicks has drastically simplified the choice of tires down to whatever compound you want to use for a particular track, and more accurately, which logo you like the look of. There are a few issues with this new setup though. For one, there's an entire topic of tire sauce. Tire sauce, or traction compound, could be considered a necessary evil in the world of 10 scale indoor dirt racing, as it does make your car drive much better. However, it's no secret that tire sauce, in terms of most of its forms, is pretty damn toxic to the human body. Now there are some non-toxic options out there, but they are becoming more popular, but for now we're dealing with highly toxic traction compound. The other kind of issue ties into the traction compound part, as the way compound works is it basically deteriorates the tire to make it softer. The problem with this is the fact that depending on how strong the traction compound is, the shorter the tire will last in terms of its lifespan. Meanwhile, in the olden days, like I mentioned before, they tended to last a lot longer as their job was to dig into the soft dirt. As a result, they tended to last a long time. Granted, this only really applies to indoor dirt racing. Carpet racing, and by extension outdoor dirt racing, doesn't have this issue most of the time. One thing that's more of a con these days when it comes to 10-scale racing is just how specialized modern day buggies have become. Remember when I said the TLR22 was a turning point in the FC 10-scale buggy design? Well, even though the car handled extremely well on the track, outside of the track it just wasn't as good to play with on the street or a BMX track. There is much bigger gap between racers and bashers these days in terms of design. Bashers mostly don't do as well on the track, and racers usually do very poorly on anything that isn't a racing specific track. Of course there are exceptions, see my previous video, but for the most part this is the current situation. As a result of this, not many companies are willing to make a car that can do double duty of track and just general fun use, for a budget specifically. Like for example, the E-Firestorm or Blitz from HPI, or the Twister from Red Cat. One major advantage modern day race buggies have over olden buggies though is durability. Up until recently, race-tuned vehicles were extra fragile. Just ask anyone who used an RC10 T3 or T4. Those things were made of glass. After seeing some of the crashes my old B64 was able to take, I'm glad these cars have gotten much more strong. Along with this, modern day buggies are generally much more adjustable and easier to work on in the modern day. Easy access diffs, holes in the ball cups to make it easier to remove and put on and adjust, and many other things that just make working on your car easier and stress-free. Now, this topic ended up a lot longer than I thought it would be, so for now we'll have to end before my PC's CPU decides to cook some bacon. I'm talking this is the 4th page out of I think 12. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more. Also, if you want to support me another way, you can subscribe to my Patreon where I post updates and teasers to my next videos. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank Michael Williams, RC World Discord server, Casey Nix, Ben Reeves, Dave Armstrong, Rob Bedingfield, Caden Merks, Ian Petrie, Zach Hawes, Jeffrey Kunz, James D. Anderson, Shane T. Ruth, Gable Barber, and especially Morrison Watt. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.